I never imagined that a simple decision to serve my country would spiral into the kind of nightmare that could make anyone question the fairness of the world. I had spent years in the military, devoted to protecting people I would never meet, sacrificing holidays, birthdays, and even moments of quiet reflection in the name of something bigger than myself. Leaving behind my home, the small ranch I had worked tirelessly to buy, complete with a modest garden, a few horses, and the pride of my family's name on the mailbox, was one of the hardest choices I ever made. I thought it was safe, that paying my HOA fees on time, maintaining the property better than anyone else in the neighborhood, and following every single regulation to the letter would ensure peace of mind while I was deployed overseas. I thought wrong. The moment I stepped on foreign soil, a series of events began to unfold that not only threatened my home but challenged the very principle of justice that I had sworn to uphold. The HOA, which I had always considered a somewhat annoying but ultimately harmless entity, suddenly became a force that seemed to operate without accountability or conscience. Letters started arriving at my mother's house, where my mail was being forwarded, a series of increasingly aggressive notices claiming I was in violation of regulations that I had never even been aware of. They cited landscaping violations, parking infractions, and, unbelievably, alleged structural changes that I had never authorized. Each letter was more hostile than the last, threatening fines, legal action, and ultimately eviction. I remember sitting in a small tent on the outskirts of a base in a country halfway around the world, staring at the faintly glowing envelope in my hand, my mind racing. How could they? I had always been meticulous, never missing a deadline, never offending anyone, never giving them even the smallest reason to question my compliance. But now, miles away from home, I realized that what I had considered a safe and secure life was anything but. I spent nights awake, drafting emails, calling back to the office where my mother worked tirelessly to act as my intermediary, trying to understand how a board of supposedly reasonable adults could escalate matters to the point of threatening someone who was serving in the military. It wasn't just frustration that gnawed at me, it was disbelief, a kind of righteous anger that built quietly but steadily, fueled by the injustice of being targeted while I had no means to defend myself in person. Each day that passed, each new letter or email from the HOA lawyer, felt like a personal attack, a strategic maneuver designed to see how far they could push me before I broke. And yet, amid the anger, I felt a strange clarity, a realization that I couldn't allow this to escalate unchecked. I couldn't let them bully me, not while I had given so much to the nation, not while I had built a life with my own two hands. So, I began to plan, quietly, meticulously, the way a seasoned soldier might prepare for a mission, gathering evidence, documenting every communication, noting every legal overstep, every discrepancy, every violation of protocol that they committed in their attempts to force me out. It was a task that required patience and restraint, both of which I had honed in years of service. I started compiling records of payments, photographs of my property, and detailed timelines of the HOA's communications, knowing that each piece of evidence would be critical if this escalated into a full-blown legal confrontation. Even more, I started to research the laws protecting military personnel from eviction and harassment while deployed, uncovering a series of federal protections I had previously only known in abstract. The more I read, the more my initial frustration began to transform into a quiet, determined resolve. I was no longer just a homeowner being bullied from afar, I was a trained professional, equipped with knowledge and a strategic mind, preparing to counteract every unjust action taken against me. While my peers on the base relaxed during their downtime, I devoted hours each night to understanding the full scope of my rights, the loopholes the HOA might try to exploit, and the ways I could leverage the law to ensure that my home remained exactly where it belonged, in my possession. I imagined the board members, smug in their sense of authority, unaware that I was quietly orchestrating a plan that would expose their incompetence and their audacity to target someone serving the country. It was a strange juxtaposition, this mix of anger and focus, but I had learned long ago that clarity often comes in the midst of adversity. Little did I know, The events set in motion during those nights of research and documentation would soon culminate in a confrontation that would shake the HOA to its core and leave an indelible mark on every member involved. I wasn't just fighting for a house, I was fighting for justice, for dignity, and for the principle that no organization, no matter how bureaucratic or emboldened, could trample over someone's life while they were fulfilling their duty to the nation. And so, what began as quiet observation and careful documentation slowly evolved into a comprehensive plan, not for revenge in the petty sense, but for rightful retribution that would ensure accountability, exposure, and ultimately, victory. As the days turned into weeks, the situation back home escalated in ways I could barely have imagined. The HOA, sensing my absence, seemed to grow bolder with each passing notice they sent. They began sending representatives to my property, taking photographs and measurements, documenting violations that didn't exist, and even speaking with neighbors to fabricate complaints. The thought that grown adults could operate with such reckless disregard for truth made my blood boil. I remember one particular evening, sitting in the dim glow of my laptop in a military housing office, reading an email from the HOA attorney that accused me of converting part of my backyard into an illegal structure, a claim that was completely fabricated. My backyard was just as I had left it, pristine and maintained, with the horses grazing peacefully and the garden flourishing under the care of my trusted neighbor. I could almost hear the smug voices of the board members imagining me powerless, thinking that they could force me out while I was oceans away. That assumption, I decided, would be their first and gravest mistake. I knew that the legal system, when properly leveraged, would protect me, but I also understood that relying solely on law without strategic planning could allow them to continue their harassment unchecked. So, I began to develop a multi-layered approach. I coordinated with my mother to document every single intrusion, every unauthorized visit, and every misleading communication. She became my eyes and ears on the ground, reporting back with meticulous notes and photographs that I could use as irrefutable evidence. I also reached out to a retired attorney friend, someone I trusted implicitly, to help me interpret the increasingly convoluted letters from the HOA's lawyers. Together, we dissected every threat, every warning, every fine they tried to impose, identifying flaws, illegalities, and procedural errors that would later become the backbone of my defense. It wasn't just about waiting for them to make a mistake. It was about ensuring that when they did, the mistake would be undeniable enough to expose the HOA's audacity to the community and the law. Each night, while my fellow soldiers unwound with television or cards, I immersed myself in HOA bylaws, city codes, and federal protections for deployed service members. The deeper I dug, the more I realized just how overstepped and reckless the HOA had been. They were so focused on asserting authority that they completely ignored the protections afforded to someone in my position. It was almost poetic. The very rules they had sworn to enforce against me were the ones that would eventually seal their downfall. I found joy in this, a sense of satisfaction that, despite their attempts to intimidate and displace me, I was preparing a countermeasure that they could not possibly anticipate. I even began compiling a comprehensive dossier, a chronological timeline of all communications, photographs of my property, letters, and affidavits from neighbors who had witnessed the harassment. Each piece was carefully annotated, cross-referenced with legal citations, and formatted in a way that would be unassailable in court or in front of a mediator. My approach was methodical, almost surgical, a reflection of years of training that taught me to observe, plan, and execute with precision. Meanwhile, the psychological toll of their harassment could not be ignored. There were moments of intense frustration, anger, and even despair, imagining them walking through my yard, taking liberties that no one had granted. But I turned these feelings into fuel, using them to maintain focus, to sharpen my attention to detail, and to reinforce the conviction that I would not be intimidated. I began envisioning how the confrontation would play out once I returned home, the moment I would step through the gate and face the board members who thought they could operate with impunity. It was not a fantasy of violence but one of strategic mastery, of revealing the truth in a way that left no room for denial. I even began practicing my approach, rehearsing the calm, measured way I would present my case, the way I would let the weight of evidence speak louder than any argument or threat they could muster. As the deployment continued, the HOA grew increasingly erratic. Letters arrived with escalating threats, fines multiplied, and a sense of desperation crept into their tone. They were becoming reckless, exposing themselves to legal repercussions with each move, and I could feel the momentum shifting. My careful planning, combined with the protections afforded to me as a service member, meant that I was no longer the target, they were. By the time I received word that they had attempted to serve me with an eviction notice in absentia, I was ready. I had compiled everything I needed for a legal counteraction that would not only invalidate their attempts but also hold them accountable for the harassment they had inflicted. It was a tense but empowering realization, one that transformed the narrative from helplessness to control. I wasn't just a homeowner fighting an overbearing HOA, I was a strategist, a defender of my own property, and soon, I would become a symbol of how courage, planning, and knowledge could stand against bureaucracy run amok. I went to bed that night with a sense of calm that I hadn't felt since leaving my home, confident that the storm raging across the miles between me and my ranch would soon be met with a force they could not withstand. Returning home from deployment was surreal. The familiar landscape, the rolling hills, the weathered fence lines, and the smell of freshly tilled earth all greeted me with a mixture of comfort and tension. I hadn't been gone for years, but enough time had passed that stepping onto my property felt like reclaiming a part of myself I had feared might have been lost. My heart raced as I approached the front gate, each step carrying a weight of anticipation that was almost tangible. I was acutely aware of what awaited me. A board of HOA members who had assumed my absence would grant them free reign over my property, a group emboldened by my distance and their own arrogance. Yet, I walked with a confidence fueled by preparation and knowledge, knowing that every move they had made while I was away had been documented, every misstep catalogued for the moment when the scales of justice would finally tip in my favor. The first sign of their hubris came almost immediately. My mother, who had been my liaison and steadfast ally, had warned me that the front lawn had been photographed, marked, and even measured as though it were some crime scene. The HOA had sent their own contractors to inspect the property, a move that was not only unauthorized but legally dubious. As I surveyed the yard, I saw their footprints, tape marks on the ground, and discarded notices fluttering in the breeze. It was almost laughable, like watching children play at authority. But the humor quickly gave way to satisfaction, knowing that each of these petty actions would now serve as evidence against them. I had spent weeks compiling every photograph, email, and correspondence into a master dossier, cross-referenced and meticulously organized, ready for presentation. Walking through the house, I noticed subtle changes, doors that had been ajar, items slightly shifted, but nothing of consequence. They had been careful not to cross certain boundaries, perhaps sensing that their boldness had limits, yet even their caution betrayed their anxiety. They knew they were overstepping, and their attempts to cover it only added to the trail of proof I had amassed. The first confrontation occurred the next morning, when the HOA president, a woman who exuded an air of superiority, arrived at my gate with a folder of documents and a rehearsed expression of authority. I greeted her calmly, acknowledging her presence, and asked her to step onto the property. Her eyes widened slightly as she noticed the cameras discreetly set up around the yard and house, security measures I had installed months prior, anticipating potential trespassers. Without any hostility, I began to outline the situation, calmly and methodically. I presented the documentation of their violations, the misrepresentations in their letters, the illegal attempt to serve an eviction notice while I was deployed, and the clear protections under federal law that shielded service members from such harassment. With each point, her composure faltered, and I could see the realization dawning that she had underestimated both my preparedness and my resolve. I wasn't shouting, I wasn't threatening, I was demonstrating, with irrefutable clarity, that every action they had taken was being countered with precise legal knowledge and evidence. Her colleagues, who had followed behind her, shifted uneasily, recognizing that the tide had turned. The confidence that had marked their communications and legal threats was replaced with nervousness and hesitancy. It was a remarkable reversal, watching authority crumble under the weight of documented truth. But I didn't stop at just presenting evidence. I had anticipated that they might attempt to argue procedural loopholes or exploit technicalities, so I had also prepared a series of remedies and counterclaims. I outlined how their actions had not only caused distress and potential damage to my property but had also subjected me and my family to undue hardship. I referenced specific statutes, previous court rulings, and the precise language of the HOA's own bylaws, demonstrating that their actions were not only misguided but legally indefensible. As the morning progressed, the board members, who had come with a sense of control and authority, found themselves on the defensive. Their attempts at rebuttal were tentative, poorly organized, and, in many cases, contradicted by the evidence I presented. I could feel the shift in the air, a mix of shock, embarrassment, and realization that their assumptions about my absence had been a grave miscalculation. The neighborhood, which had been aware of the tension but largely kept distant, began to observe the unfolding events. Neighbors who had once whispered about the aggressive HOA now quietly nodded in acknowledgement, seeing the situation play out with their own eyes. It was clear that the power dynamics had shifted, that the HOA was no longer the unquestioned authority, and that I had reclaimed not just my home, but my dignity and control over the situation. By the end of that day, the board left my property in a state of muted defeat, their paperwork in disarray, their confidence shaken. They had underestimated me, underestimated the protections afforded to service members, and underestimated the meticulous planning that can turn frustration and injustice into a methodical, undeniable counteraction. As I locked the gate that evening, I felt a profound sense of relief and triumph. The house that had been threatened during my absence was secure, my reputation intact, and the principle of justice restored. I realized that this confrontation, while intense and exhausting, had taught me an invaluable lesson: preparation, patience, and knowledge are far more powerful than intimidation or misplaced authority. I had not just defended my property, I had demonstrated, unequivocally, that attempts to exploit absence and arrogance can be met with precision and resolve. And as night fell over the familiar landscape, I knew that the story of this victory would echo far beyond my own experience, serving as a reminder that even the most overbearing entities cannot prevail when faced with determination, strategy, and unwavering adherence to truth. In the days that followed, the aftermath of the confrontation became increasingly apparent. The HOA, once so confident and unyielding, began to scramble behind closed doors, attempting to regroup and salvage the remnants of their authority. Letters, once threatening and bold, slowed to vague and cautious notices. Phone calls that had carried a tone of menace now became hesitant inquiries. It was clear that my meticulous documentation and strategic presentation had shaken the very foundation of their confidence. I took this time not to gloat, but to reinforce the security of my position and to ensure that no further attempts at intimidation could gain traction. My focus shifted toward consolidating control over my property and reinforcing the legal boundaries that had protected me. I worked closely with my mother and my attorney friend, reviewing each piece of communication, verifying the compliance of every procedure, and preparing a detailed plan for any eventuality. I knew that once an organization like the HOA had tasted defeat, they could attempt more subtle maneuvers to regain control, so preemptive vigilance became essential. My strategy extended beyond simple legal documentation. It involved careful communication with neighbors, many of whom had been wary or neutral during the disputes. I took the time to explain my position, not in boastful terms, but with a calm, rational recounting of the events. I provided evidence, showed them the legal protections in place, and emphasized that the HOA had overstepped its authority in ways that were not just petty but unlawful. By doing so, I built a quiet but strong coalition of community awareness, ensuring that any future actions by the HOA would be met not just with my resistance, but with the collective recognition of their accountability. Beyond the legal and social maneuvers, I devoted time to repairing and enhancing my property. It was a symbolic and practical step, ensuring that my home not only remained secure but thrived in the face of adversity. I fixed minor damages that had occurred during the HOA's unauthorized inspections, reinforced security measures, and upgraded areas of the property that had long needed attention. Each improvement felt like reclaiming a piece of agency that had been threatened, a tangible manifestation of my resilience. As the weeks passed, the board members began to make overtures of reconciliation, requesting meetings under the guise of cooperation and compromise. I approached these interactions with cautious professionalism, aware that their motives were not purely conciliatory. Every request was carefully analyzed, every statement cross-checked with documentation and legal guidance. I responded calmly but firmly, setting clear boundaries and expectations while maintaining the moral high ground. Their attempts at negotiation often revealed further lapses in procedure and compliance, which I meticulously recorded. Each misstep strengthened my position and highlighted the systemic flaws within the HOA that had allowed such harassment to occur in the first place. I also took the opportunity to educate myself further about property law, HOA governance, and federal protections for service members. What had begun as a personal battle evolved into a deep understanding of structural and legal systems, allowing me to anticipate actions, counteract threats, and ultimately wield knowledge as my most effective tool. The community, witnessing these developments, began to view me not just as a homeowner defending his rights, but as an informed and proactive member of the neighborhood. Their respect and support became another layer of protection, a subtle but powerful reminder to the HOA that authority unchallenged can quickly lose credibility when confronted with preparation and truth. By the end of this period, the HOA's tone had shifted dramatically. Letters were no longer aggressive, representatives approached with caution, aware that any misstep could be exposed and held accountable. I had created an environment where intimidation was impossible, where strategy, patience, and evidence determined the outcome rather than bluster or bureaucratic overreach. Reflecting on the experience, I recognized that the lessons extended far beyond the confines of property disputes. I had learned the value of anticipation, the importance of meticulous preparation, and the power of knowledge applied with precision. I had discovered that injustice, no matter how entrenched, can be challenged successfully with patience, determination, and unwavering adherence to truth. The sense of control and accomplishment was profound. Not only had I protected my property, but I had also fortified my standing in the community and reinforced the principle that no organization can operate above accountability. It was a victory that resonated deeply, a testament to the idea that measured, informed action is far more powerful than reactive anger or blind resistance. And as I watched the sun set over the property I had fought to defend, I felt a quiet satisfaction in knowing that the house, the land, and the integrity of the process had all been preserved against those who had thought they could take advantage of my absence. The final chapter of this ordeal unfolded with a sense of inevitability, as though every calculated step I had taken was converging toward a decisive resolution. The HOA, once audacious and confrontational, now approached with a subdued, almost apologetic demeanor, their previous confidence replaced with a recognition that their tactics had failed and that they had underestimated both my resolve and my preparedness. I had spent months building a comprehensive record, from emails and photographs to detailed witness statements and legal research, and it had culminated in an unassailable position. The board members now sat across from me in a conference room I had prepared for this exact moment, their expressions a mixture of tension and disbelief, knowing that any attempt to intimidate or coerce would be met with precise counteraction. I began the meeting by calmly outlining the timeline of events, presenting my evidence in a structured and professional manner. Each infraction, each overreach, each letter and unauthorized inspection was laid bare, illustrating a pattern of harassment and procedural violations that could not be ignored. I watched as their attempts to argue, to spin, or to justify their actions crumbled in real time, the weight of documented truth and legal precedents leaving them with little more than silence and awkward glances. What had started as personal frustration evolved into a methodical demonstration of accountability, not only ensuring my rights as a homeowner but also reinforcing the principle that no entity, regardless of bureaucratic authority, is immune to oversight and consequence. As the meeting progressed, I made it clear that while I was willing to maintain a civil and cooperative relationship moving forward, any further attempts at harassment or unlawful action would be met with legal remedies and exposure to the broader community. This assertion was backed by a level of preparation and credibility that left no room for doubt, and it was reflected in the subtle shifts in body language, the tension in the air, and the quiet acknowledgement of defeat that settled over the board. Beyond the immediate confrontation, I took steps to institutionalize protections for the future. I ensured that all correspondence was documented, that security measures were robust, and that any potential loopholes in the HOA's procedures were addressed in advance. My neighbors, who had observed the unfolding events, were reassured by the clarity and fairness of the outcome, recognizing that accountability had prevailed without resorting to vindictiveness or unnecessary conflict. In the days that followed, the HOA's communications became routine, devoid of threat or malice. The sense of control I had established persisted, not as a product of intimidation, but as a result of meticulous planning, strategic action, and unwavering adherence to truth and legality. Reflecting on the experience, I realized that the ordeal had transformed me, instilling an even deeper understanding of resilience, the importance of preparedness, and the power of knowledge applied with precision. I had confronted an unjust system, not with aggression or recklessness, but with strategy, patience, and methodical execution, and the outcome had reaffirmed the principle that injustice, no matter how bold, can be met and overcome when met with courage and informed action. The house, my property, and my reputation were secure, but more importantly, the lesson extended far beyond bricks and land. It spoke to the capacity for a single individual to assert rights, defend principles, and maintain integrity in the face of adversity. The finality of the resolution brought a profound sense of peace, a recognition that the months of tension, preparation, and confrontation had not only preserved my home but strengthened my confidence, my understanding of authority, and my ability to navigate complex challenges. As I stood on the porch, surveying the land I had fought to protect, the sunlight glinting off the fences and the horses grazing calmly in the distance, I felt a deep sense of accomplishment and assurance. The HOA's attempts to intimidate, to exploit my absence, and to overstep their bounds had been met with methodical, unwavering, and ultimately victorious resistance. The experience had reinforced a fundamental truth: preparation, knowledge, patience, and a steadfast commitment to justice are more powerful than any attempt at coercion or bullying. And in that quiet moment, I understood that the real victory was not just retaining my home, but proving to myself, the community, and the overreaching authority that even in the face of arrogance and injustice, integrity and determination will prevail. My home was safe, my rights intact, and the lesson clear: no obstacle, no matter how formidable, could withstand the resolve of someone committed to defending what is theirs with intelligence, strategy, and unwavering moral certainty. That day, I knew with absolute clarity that the HOA would never again attempt to challenge me, not because they were threatened, but because they understood that justice, once meticulously prepared and unapologetically executed, cannot be undermined or ignored.